Hi, I'm Austin Wintory, and this is the Game Maker's Notebook. Today I talk with the composer Gordy Haab, who has had a pretty spectacular career as the heir apparent to John Williams. He has written, by our estimation from this conversation, 4 times more Star Wars music than John Williams has at this point, by scoring just about every major Star Wars game that has been made over the last 10 to 15 year period. And he is just exploding with musical insight and wisdom. We got into a lot of depth about all of it. It was a blast. I actually really felt like I learned quite a few things from our conversation, and I hope you do too. Gordy Haab, somebody whose last name took me a long time to feel like I was pronouncing correctly. You must get a lot of Haab.
Yeah, I get Haab more often than I get Hab, honestly, to the point where I've just stopped correcting people. Now I accept either. So
I think if I had not heard you say it, like I was listening to an interview and I had one of these private, it's Hab. What is the etymology of Hab, actually? It makes me realize I've never asked you that.
Yeah, so Haab is probably what it originally was.
Does that mean it was German?
German.
Yeah, okay.
And, when my family immigrated from that side of the family immigrated from Germany during like the First World War, it was unpopular to be seen as German, I suppose. So they tried to Americanize the pronunciation.
That's exactly where Wintory comes from.
Is it? Interesting.
Because the family was named Weinberger. And they were like, fuck Germany, we're done with this shit. It was 1939 and feeling salty, and said they tried to invent what sounded like an American name, and Wintory was the concoction, and has left people confused for the last 90 years as a result, because they go, what Wintory is that? And it's like this origin of that? Yeah, I get all these guesses that are basically just a reflection of the person making the guess more than anything, because it's not grounded in anything. But in any case, thanks for jumping on. You've had a rather excellent year so far. I can't think of many composers with New York Times billboards of their projects. That's a pretty rare coup.
That was pretty cool, I'd have to say.
Yeah, for real. So congrats on that. Sort of King Star Wars himself, with Star Destroyer over the shoulder accordingly. And you're
obligatory. Yep. You gotta have it.
Yep. And what we can't see, and unless you've changed it, is you're also rather awesome Star Wars rug beneath your feet.
Oh yeah, exactly.
Right now, which I'm a fan of.
Yeah. For sure.
So obviously there's a lot to talk about, all things Star Wars, but why don't we just kind of be slightly formal almost about it, and let's go back to the earliest days, because I know the exact moment. I would love, basically tell me the story of what led you to all of this, because at some point you'll name the project that became the first time I knew who you were. I'm very curious how much runway before that there is, because the classic phenomenon of everybody always comes out of nowhere.
Yeah, of course.
Everybody else,
like 10 years prior to that. Yeah, exactly.
So that's where I'm curious.
Yeah, for sure. So I can go way back, but I'll start when I moved to LA.
I want to hear sperm and egg onward.
Yep. All right, there you go. So 6 years old, saw E.T. in the theater. Only remembered the music, forgot all the characters. My parents thought, let's get him into music.
It wasn't emotionally traumatizing to see that movie at that age?
It was a little bit, but the takeaway for me was I was singing the theme. It's like getting grilled by my parents, like, what did you think of Elliot's character? I'm like, who? But I can sing the melodies, so it was just, I just latched on to music pretty quickly, and that kind of like, was the beginning of me sort of exploring music as something for fun. Eventually became something very serious to me. Fast forward, I moved to Los Angeles to go to USC for the film scoring program.
Well, actually, wait, before contained within that fast forward is a crucial juncture, because every composer has that moment where they start music lessons of some stripe or another as a kid,
Yeah.
And then realize I actually kind of want to write music instead of just become a pianist or a trumpet player
exactly.
or blah, 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 blah. How did that happen for you?
Yeah. So I mean, a couple things I think factored into this. So the first instrument I ever played was guitar. My dad's a guitar player. He taught me to play. And so I started a rock band. And I mean, we sucked, you know, but we didn't have any songs. So somebody had to write some songs. So my buddy and I in the band decided to start writing songs together. And that was sort of my first, you know, take at, you know, writing music, creating original music. And I just really enjoyed the process of doing that much more than the result, so to speak. Just the idea of like bouncing ideas. Yeah, exactly. It's totally like the 3-chord version of Gordy. And
it's, you know, that's so mind blowing. I can't believe I've never actually known that about your background until this moment, because I think of you as one of the most rigorously capable composers from the other side of the tracks. Like you think of most, there's like the John Williams types and then the Danny Elfman types.
Right.
And what you're describing is that you secretly started in the Danny Elfman world and then kind of like under cover of darkness, you kind of ran the border.
Yeah, in a way, yeah. I mean, it's actually kind of true. Yeah, I mean, I was like straight up started as a, you know, a wannabe rock guitarist and songwriter. And, you know, that kind of, then I started also playing trombone in the middle school band. So, you know, and that was like a thing. And I actually really enjoyed that as well. So that's like how I learned to read music and, you know, play in an ensemble and kind of understand how music works in a large ensemble setting, that kind of deal.
Plus wind ensemble always plays like contemporary work and
totally.
They're not just mindlessly kind of plumbing the classical rep as
exactly. Yeah. In fact, I'd never played in an orchestra until I was in college. I mean, we had no orchestra to play in where I grew up in the small town of Mechanicsville, Virginia. Is
Mechanicsville sounds like a town that Tim Schafer would name the town in some, like in a, you know, a LucasArts 90s point and click adventure where you need this sort of every town USA kind of vibe.
Yeah, exactly. And it kind of was that in many ways.
Amazing.
You know? I mean, I was born in Richmond, which is a city in Virginia. You know, if you know of a city in Virginia, it's probably Richmond. Yeah. So I was born there, but, you know, probably like 8 or 9 years old, we moved slightly outside of Richmond to the lovely town of Mechanicsville, where I found myself, you know, not having a ton in common with the kids around me, because I was like really into art and music. And Mechanicsville, you know, the kids were into like, you know, farm equipment and, you know, cars and
electrical engineering and
the name kind of says it all. I mean, it really does sum up the town. You know, I mean, there was Jason Mraz of all people also grew up in Mechanicsville, and we went to high school together. That's like the one other like music person that sort of like dropped on the scene. Yeah, no. So we're still actually friends. And
that's so funny. I never knew that either.
Yep. Kind of a weird little background. But you know, playing in the marching bands and stuff like that, you know, and it was always out of sort of necessity that I was writing music, because, you know, hey, we'd want to do something in the stands at a football game, but, you know, the band director didn't have a arrangement of a song. And I was really into writing music by that point. You know, it was sort of a thing I was getting into. So he would say, hey, you want to do an arrangement of X song for us to play on Friday night? And I'd do that, and we'd rehearse it once and play it. And I started doing that pretty often. And that led me to want to write. You know, when you're 13 years old, the notion of I'm going to write a symphony is so pretentious and absurd. But, you know, I was 13, so that's what I wanted to do. And I got about, you know, 8 minutes worth of that written.
Hey, that's pretty good.
I wrote this piece for the high school wind ensemble, you know, and we got to put it on a concert, and, you know, people clapped, and, you know, and it sounded cool. And like all the other players in the band, they all like enjoyed playing it. And it was like a moment for me, you know, like I could get used to this. This is fun. You know, this is a abstract way to create art and, you know, do something I enjoy and actually get to see it sort of unfold in real time in front of an audience and, you know, get a reaction.
Would you say that was the tipping point that made you take it seriously as a professional ambition, or was that the validation that this ambition you already had was plausible?
So it's kind of a bit of both. I mean, that was the tipping point that made me consider, oh, I could probably pursue this as like a real hobby or maybe eventual career. I'd always thought about the idea of going into music, but I had sort of imagined I would go into something more on the performing side of music. And then the writing thing would always just be this thing that you did because nobody else could do it. So I'd always have like sort of a job. I could be the arranger in the band or whatever,
right.
Which, trombone players as a group tend to be arrangers because there's so few gigs for trombone. So we have to do something else in music to keep alive.
Make your own.
Yeah. So it's kind of common. And, it just kind of made sense for me to try to learn how to write for different sizes of ensembles and that kind of thing. And do the arrangements for the bands I was playing in. But that one concert, that piece that I had written for this wind ensemble and getting to hear it on a concert and getting a response from it, that was the tipping point that was like, maybe I could pursue composing music as my main thing rather than performing it. And because, to be quite honest with you, I had performed many times and I didn't get a response like that from an audience or from peers around me. It was the composing thing that sort of gave me this instant sort of feedback. And, that could be for a number of reasons. It could be because I sucked as a performer, which is very likely. But for sure, this thing actually kind of succeeded and it was a lot of fun. And so I'm like, well, maybe I should do this. And then I started getting into it. I wanted to write more things. I would ask friends like, hey, can I write for your little, brass quintet or whatever and do that, or write for little string quartets. And so I just got into doing it. And I knew nothing about writing music. I was just writing by ear. I knew enough about reading music so I could actually write things and notate it. But
so it was all driven by instinct. You hadn't studied theory or any kind of composition lessons.
Totally. Yeah. I actually didn't really study writing music or do anything formal for composition training until I got to college.
Right.
So everything up to that point was just me kind of figuring it out by ear.
Yeah.
And, honestly, I think that's a really valuable.
Reverse engineering music.
Yeah.
Bach would take Vivaldi manuscripts and recopy the parts as a way to learn and
just to learn it. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. It's a pretty time honored way to do it, and you learn differently than when someone else has curated what they think the takeaways of this style of counterpoint or that way of orchestration, blah blah blah. When someone's already funneling their interests, it's gonna bias you. But if you're just like, oh wow, I really like the way the violas sound here, and it's only because I've fixated on them just by following my nose, that's
exactly,
gonna just take you new places.
It totally does. And, sometimes I'd do something that probably was completely wrong, but it would result in something that sounded really cool to me. And, a lot of those things ended up in my bag of tricks over the years. And right or wrong, I liked them, so I kind of held on to some concepts that I'd come up with early on. And, and it was in a way when I actually went to college, and I went to a school in Virginia called Virginia Commonwealth University, which is in Richmond, where I was born. And it wasn't really until then that I sort of started discovering that it wasn't that I was doing anything wrong. It was that there were easier ways to do the things I was doing or more effective ways to get the same result, that kind of thing. And I found this, I found a true mentor in this guy that was the jazz arranging instructor at the school. This guy, Doug Richards. And I wasn't studying jazz, but I was really into jazz at the time. And I went to college for music education. I mean, I had not even considered doing a composition degree. It was sort of everyone would say, well, you could study composition, but when you leave, you have this degree in composition. What are you going to do with it? At least have some kind of fallback plan. So I was like, okay, I'll focus on composition while I do an ed degree, And it wasn't until I met this guy, Doug Richards, who was running the jazz program, where I sort of feel like I found my avenue, and it was really in jazz performance and jazz composition. And he kind of took me under his wing, and I changed my major to be jazz composition. And that is ultimately what I have as an undergrad degree, is a degree in jazz composition. And this guy, he kind of put me through the ringer. He was one of these old school tough teachers that, not necessarily like breaking my knuckles with a ruler kind of thing, but you know, if there's a modern version of that,
it's like the Damien Chazelle movie, the Whiplash, you know.
Yes, honestly, and I'm not lying to you, it is well rumored that character is based on the teacher that I studied with in Virginia.
Really?
Yeah.
Oh wow.
Yeah.
That's hilarious.
I've seen music stands fly across the room that these things happened, you know. And we all loved him, and that was the thing. It was like, yeah, we were potentially getting abused, but we all respected him so much.
I think that film does such a good job at walking the line between, it's not trying to defend his abusive behavior, but it's also not trying to say that if you want to try to be truly great, that this isn't gonna help push you there, you know, like the film kind of lives in that gray area of that middle zone, because, you know, there's no denying that while there's many ways to try to derive greatness from somebody or help them achieve it, this is definitely one historically,
it's an avenue,
way to do it. Yeah. That's crazy that he was possibly, did Damien Chazelle come from that area or no?
I actually don't know. That's a good question. I'd be curious to know like what the origin of that is, but in the jazz community, that has been discussed many times.
Wow, that's so
Doug
funny.
Richards, because anyone that studied with Doug Richards kind of saw that movie and were like, "Oh shit, that's him." You know, oh my god, I remember being on the other end of that. You know, I was one time the trombone player in that band where he's just like, "Nope, it's wrong. Play it again. Play it by yourself. Play it over and over." And like, you know, spend the entire rehearsal on like 2 measures by myself, just like slowly melting into a puddle of tears while all my friends just listen to me get, you know, completely tortured.
Now I get why you're such an asshole.
Exactly,
clear,
man.
yeah,
it's so clear.
You're so prone to such volatility and like flying off the handle that now I get it.
Oh man, that gave me like a strong foundation musically, but also like really thick skin, if you know what I mean. So
I mean,
which is valuable.
Destination Los Angeles. So
yeah, I mean, certainly valuable in this business. So no, I mean, I just remember like he would do this thing where randomly he would just stop class, pick a person, and set a stopwatch, and and give you a chord quality, say, you know, dominant 7th chords, go, and you had 20 seconds to recite the names of all the notes and all the dominant chords around the circle of fifths, like C, G, B flat, F, A, C, E flat, blah, 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 just like rattling it off. And so like I would, as I'm walking to and from school every day, in the cadence of my own walking, I'd just be reciting the like chord tones of every possible chord quality, you know, like just kind of building this stuff into my head. So, you know, cause I wouldn't want to be embarrassed in class, you know.
I know I shouldn't romanticize what that kind of grilling does to somebody, but I you know, it's I mean, you know how I feel about your writing. I like to not be shy about it, and especially in the you know, we'll get to the present day soon enough, but just there's a real difference between somebody who has sat in front of a sequencer and gotten pretty competent at writing orchestral music based around the feedback they get from sample libraries,
right,
versus somebody that seems to have that deeper kind of genetic relationship with it. There's you can just feel the difference in the handling of all the rudimentary elements, the voice leading, the voice leading and the voicing, sort of horizontal and vertical, both are real good tipping points. And it's pretty hard to get that confident in one's technique without some version. It doesn't have to be overtly sort of hostile, but
right. Yeah.
But you know, just, it really does actually explain in a way that I hadn't appreciated until this conversation, how you have such confident control over these elements, because you had to live in the music deeply. This wasn't just, Thursdays at 2:00 we're doing this. It was like, it really does sound like that Whiplash, you know, like you have to break up with your girlfriend because you need all the time possible, you know, kind of thing.
I mean, it was, in a way it was like that, you know. I devoted well, I also went to undergrad for 6 years, so but that's a different story. That was because I wanted to take a bunch of classes that had nothing to do with my major, like scuba diving and tennis. I was having a lot of fun with the fact that I had a scholarship, so it was kind of nice. I took the long scenic route, if you will, but so I had I guess 2 years of like working with this guy in a classroom setting, and then because he sort of latched on to me as much as I latched on to him, and he took me under his wing and became my mentor. And I studied with him privately for another 4 years after that. And we became like extremely close. Like I still consider him like, my strongest mentor and one of my closest friends. So, hey, if you're listening, I'm not trying to talk shit, baby. It's all good. Although I don't think he has a computer, so he's probably not listening. All that stuff, man, it worked for me. I don't know if it works for everyone, but like that sort of that hard ass, mentor, mentality kind of, it clicked for me at the time when I was young and sort of still like, malleable and, could have gone off of multiple paths, and I really wasn't exactly sure what I wanted to do. And, I knew I wanted it to be music and I wanted to write music. I didn't know what style of music and so what ultimately kind of came from that is that none of that even mattered if you learn the fundamentals of writing music and how music works and how the instruments work and what they're capable of and how voice leading works and how it can, change the effect of something musically, or, what rules to break in order to get an effect. It's like knowing the rules in order to break the rules kind of thing. Mm-hmm. And so, I just got really into it, and I took all of his advice very, to heart, and really just studied and practiced and, got sort of good at my craft. And, at that point, like after I finished undergrad, it was really a matter of where do I go from here if I really want to pursue like an actual career where I make money writing music? Because like, there were a couple options for someone in, who's a composing student. It's like, you could go teach it. You could be, hey, if you're independently wealthy, then freaking awesome, go write your concert music and you don't have to worry about how you make a living. That wasn't my case. So it was either like find a patron or find an industry where they actually pay people to write music. And that at that time to me was film.
Right.
And it all kind of tied in because like the original thing that made me really love music in the first place was actually the first time I experienced music in a film. That's the first time in my life I can recall noticing music in sort of that visceral way that really just like, dug into my soul. I mean, I loved pop music, and I can remember like, the day that Thriller came out and I waited in line to buy my copy of that album with my parents, and that was impactful, but I loved that music because it was fun, but it didn't have like this, it didn't make me cry, you know what I mean? But E.T. did, and it was something about the music that was making that happen. And so I just had this fascination like all my life with the emotional impact of music, and that seemed to be like very prevalent in film. So it just seemed fitting that I go into film. So I made the exact opposite choice and decided to go to Manhattan School of Music for grad school. At which point I had a teacher there who said, hey, I think if you really want to do this, you should look at USC because they have this film scoring program. It's a 1-year thing. And before I even started at Manhattan School, I stopped in my tracks, applied for that program, was accepted, and then moved to LA like 6 months later. So
does that mean did you go to the MSN
for half of one semester? Yeah.
Wow.
Yep. I got halfway through a semester before I was like, you know what? You're right. This is the wrong path.
I think, did Elliot Goldenthal go there?
That sounds familiar.
I feel like he's among their kind of noteworthy alumni, but I could be making
that probably makes sense. And I was like I was definitely more in the jazz program, so I didn't really dabble much in the classical side of things. But, I also figured out pretty quickly that, writing jazz for a living was like, was an exercise in torture. So, the film thing just was looking prettier and prettier.
It's amazing how in a world where it's really difficult to earn a living as a concert music composer, somehow jazz composing is like, hold my beer. You don't even know how hard it can be. I mean,
in a way it's true. I mean, jazz musicians tend to understand music on such a deep theoretical level You know, I mean,
Oh,
obviously, like we study classical theory and that kind of thing, but then when you get into jazz theory, it's like it's basically the evolution of classical music theory. You
oh,
know,
hundred
the way
percent.
music functions, the way chords and harmony function, it's just even deeper in jazz in a way, similar but deeper in like the conventional.
It's sort of
You know,
almost like the difference between Newtonian physics versus relativistic physics, where classical theory, like, and functional harmony, which is essentially all classical theory really boils down to,
exactly.
It's a very kind of narrow but effective view. It's sort of, for what it's doing, it will answer all the questions. But quantum mechanics and sort of relativity say, but there's actually quite a lot more going on, especially at the edges where things are at their craziest. And that's where sort of jazz to me would be a good corollary, because it's sort of like it can analyze relationships anywhere of any sort, where you realize you can find your place under any circumstance. Whereas you can have voicings that if you try to analyze through a more sort of functional harmony lens, it's just like, I don't know. It's just I added notes. That's all I can really say about it through that lens.
Right. But when you dig into it, you can see that there is actually a functionality there, because it's like, oh, if you boil it down to the most simple elements that are happening there, you're like, oh, this is just, minor 2, dominant 5 to a 1, or like, like a 4-5-1. You're like, oh, that's classical, music theory 101. But then when you expand out from it, when you go out to the fringe edge of it, and you're like looking at all these like hyper extensions of chords and, like all the colorful notes that are there. And if you look at only those and strip away the foundation of it, somehow they sound sort of like this weird nebulous, like washy thing, but they are still related to their core, functionality. And because of that, they work. And then you can add in like solid voice leading, and suddenly it's like, this is functional harmony, but it sounds so vastly different than what people probably think of as like conventional functional harmony from like classical music.
Oh yeah.
And there is the, sort of invention of jazz in a way. And it trains your ears as well to hear things a lot deeper, I think,
Oh yeah. I think it also, classical theory is so vertically oriented. It doesn't have a lot to say about where things are going in the sense of line.
Right.
And that's so important, because improvisation is so core to jazz, that the idea of where am I headed and what's the tension and release of the line itself, that's like, that to me feels, I mean, I didn't formally study jazz, but that has always felt to me at the core of what really defines so much of jazz. Is not just thick chords. It's actually always about the trajectory and where things are going.
Yeah, so it's always leading ahead. Like it's like a chess match, where it's like you're seeing 5 moves ahead. It's like, how do I get from here to there? It's like there's this route that you can take to get there.
That's why I love these YouTube videos that do transcription. They'll upload transcriptions of great soloists, and I love where you can really like pause and really kind of go almost note by note analyzing, and realize just the level of brain power that's operating in some of these true, like, best of the best jazz soloists, and to be improvising. It's why it's so cool to me that someone like Jacob Collier has achieved something borderline pop culture success, because what he does,
I agree, because it's
superhuman.
He's superhuman. That dude's a complete freak. I mean, unbelievable. What a talent. I mean,
he hears things, and he leverages them in his work that are simply beyond.
They're beyond my own comprehension, and I consider myself like pretty, knowledgeable about, harmony and how it functions. And then I see this kid come along, and I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah, when he did his Moon River, that culminates in a modulation to G half sharp major, because he just felt that 50 cents sharp was the precise color he wanted. And the fact that he modulates into it so elegantly, where it doesn't feel like you've just applied a kind of pitch correction. It's so smooth that when you hear it, I didn't catch that he had done it. I don't have perfect pitch. So when I was listening to it, I just thought, wow, that's so bright. And so what unbelievable kind of musicianship. And then when I watched his analysis, I thought, holy shit.
It's fascinating, man. That's a really cool video, by the way. And it's fascinating to me how that works. Because I'm like you. Well, I mean, for years, I said I had perfect pitch. I later in, early adulthood realized that what I had was really strong, like relative pitch.
Right.
I don't have perfect pitch. I relate pitches to colors. I have this like synesthesia thing.
Yeah,
So,
right.
like
Sure.
I can just, when I see blue, I can hear a B flat kind of thing. But
Yeah.
I always have, if you're like sing a C, I have to like picture blue, hear the B flat, go up a step.
Right.
You know what I mean? So I can tell you, I can sing a C to you, but it takes me a split second longer. And then there's some people where it's just like, it's instant. That, I think that's the perfect pitch. And that guy is like, man, unbelievable what he's doing,
Yeah.
That's a talent,
Oh yeah, no, so
and
well,
improvisation skills. So that's also something I just think is mind blowing to me. Like in the jazz world, the reason that like I went into composition and instead of performing is because improvisers on another level to me. That's like, it's literally like looking at a very complex chord structure, like harmony structure in a jazz piece. You see it just written out only as the chords. It's almost like looking at the scaffolding of a building and then on the fly improvising, everything that decorates it into like, whatever, some, modern structure, in real time. That's something I was never very capable of doing. I have to sit and think and overthink and overthink again. And then eventually I have some music to listen to. But
well, I relate to that.
Yeah.
All right. So 6 months or what, half a semester or whatever at Manhattan School of Music, you came out to USC,
Yep.
SMP TV program. And so how did the transition go into actually landing work? Because we're getting pretty dangerously close, I suspect, to that moment where I heard your name first, because I suspect it was not terribly long after.
Not long after USC, I would think, I'm imagining. So right after USC, I mean, I met a lot of student filmmakers while I was at USC, who I worked with on, short films and this kind of thing, like most composers do when they first get into it. You try to meet young filmmakers and, score their projects for no money and get experience and build up a reel and all these things. But I've always been kind of into like daily exercise of some form. So at that time I was into running. And so I was just out for a jog and I saw this yard sale. Someone was having like a garage sale or whatever, and they had all this Star Wars memorabilia. And I thought to myself, on my way back, I need to stop there as like an uber Star Wars fan and go see what this guy has, because he might have some toys that I didn't have as a kid that I need to snatch up. And so running back home, kind of sweaty, thinking, do I really want to stop here? I'm kind of gross, but no, I need to see what the guy's got. So I stopped for just a minute. And the guy that was running the little garage sale was this guy, Mark Zickery is his name, but he was running this group of filmmakers that would get together once a week on Thursday nights at the IHOP in Hollywood to troubleshoot their independent projects. Each person would get a couple minutes to say, this is what I'm working on. These are the speed bumps I'm running over. And then the group would sort of brainstorm together and help each other out. And he said, come check it out. And so I went and I brought like this old school boombox and a CD of some of my music. And I was like, I took my 3 minutes and I said, here it is, hit play. That's who I am. And then people started hiring me out of that group.
Wow.
And,
wait, but did you get any Star Wars stuff from the yard sale? I need to know.
No, I didn't buy a thing. Because everything you had was like legit perfect condition, and they were all like selling for like, this little toy was like $1,000 or something.
Okay, so it's not yard sale. It's not the right venue.
I was a broke composer just out of school, so
that's so funny.
But I did meet a guy that introduced me to like 100 filmmakers all in one, swipe.
Yeah, talk about
that was pretty impressive.
Yeah,
pretty
sort of whatever the really good version of stamping on a landmine is.
Basically that, yeah, and
amazing.
A couple of the people, one of the directors that I had met there was working on this little horror film, this little short film. It's kind of a take on the monkey's paw, which is like kind of a famous little story that's been done 1,000 times. And so I scored this thing, and he showed me this other film that he had made a year or two before called Ryan versus Dorkman. And it was he and his buddy fighting with lightsabers in like an old, tortilla factory. I mean, they're just in like the regular clothes fighting with lightsabers, but the choreography was so fucking awesome. And I'm just like, oh my God, that's amazing. He's like, I'm making a second one. Do you want to score it? And I was like, I 100% would love to score that. That would be like super cool. And this is like, you know, when YouTube was sort of just kind of a thing, you know,
right.
Like early 2000s, something like that. And so I did this thing, and I did it with a good buddy of mine, Kyle Newmaster, who's also a composer. And, you know, because I was busy on other stuff, and I'm like, man, you want to help me out with this thing? It's like 6 minutes of music. We have like a week to put it together. I got them to promise to hire an orchestra, you know, just for like 2 hours. Let's get an orchestra in Capitol Records.
Where are they coming up with the money for that? I mean, short films.
Yeah, we suggested. I told the guy, the director, I was like, this guy's name is Mike Scott, and I said, hey, Mike, man, if you put a video on YouTube, you know, and attach it to your first one, because it had like 1 million views or something, which is a whole lot back then. Like 1 million views was like insane. I was like, attach a little video to it saying that you're raising money to hire an orchestra to score your second installment of this. And, you know, and he did that. He just put his address, and people were sending like envelopes with like change. And in a week, he raised $35,000. Like,
what? Wow, you invented like, Kickstarter before Kickstarter.
I kind of invented Kickstarter.
Holy shit! So it was Kyle versus Dorkman II that I first came across you, because it was one of those of like, wow, this is a pretty legit Star Wars, like sort of like, you know, stab at that sound, you know, and at that aesthetic, and it was so committed to, you couldn't not notice it. But I knew that you had done a recording for an otherwise humble little short film, but I didn't know that this part of it literally just getting mailed. That's so damn.
I mean, it was pretty amazing. We were getting like, I mean, seriously, just straight. Some people were donating like $1,000, and then other people were literally sending like 50 cents, you know, in an envelope, because they were just fans of the first one, you know. And every single person that sent something got their name in the credit. So it's actually only like a 3-minute video, but it's 6 minutes long on YouTube, because they had the credit crawl is like as long as the actual film itself.
Donations.
Yeah. Anyway, if you sent 50 cents, it was you were in the credits. So it was kind of a cool opportunity for the fans of the first one, and amazingly, they raised enough money to do it. You know, we got like a 60-piece group in Capitol Records for a couple hours. And
60?
You know. 60, yeah.
How the hell did you fit 60 in Capitol?
Oh, we had brass and B and strings and winds. And
you were doing the sort of the door sort of split.
Exactly, thing? Yeah, like half open, and then all the percussion, everything else was all sampled.
Right.
But no, actually, no, I take that back. The percussion was not sampled. I went over to MB Gordy's studio, and we striped all the percussion, and he just did it as a favor. Because we were just,
he didn't want to get in on that envelope
on that awesome change. Money. I was like, I can bring you a couple envelopes of change if you want. And he's like, no, man, it's good. Just hire me on something big later, you know. And
that's funny.
And that was my first Star Wars anything, you know. And
what year would that have been then? What's our?
I think it was like 2005, maybe. It feels about right. Somewhere around 2005 is my guess.
Wow. Yeah, because
it was versus Dorkman II. It's easy to find on there. It's still on YouTube, you know.
Because I remember it going kind of, you know, sort of predictably going viral with because they'd also done proper VFX of the lightsabers and stuff, and it was pretty legit for a fan film. But I also remember being part of or going to, I don't remember actually if my music was on the show or not, but I remember going to a Golden State Pops concert where they
actually performed that.
Played it. Yeah,
that's right. Man, I had completely forgotten about that.
And,
crazy enough, Steve Fox we just had a conversation about 10 minutes before we jumped on this call, and that's the first time we even thought about that orchestra in like years. So that's really
so funny. Yeah, no, I always loved that they were always such champions of not just playing film music, but cultivating kind of unexpected choices. And that's a perfect example of one where there's not a lot of concert halls where you can go watch a full orchestra put on a show that's going to include Ryan versus Dorkman II. You know what I mean?
Not only does that never happen, it has not happened since. So, but it was pretty cool and it was really fun. And like you know, that was the first time you probably heard anything that I had written. But also it caught the attention of some folks at LucasArts. and they were making a Indiana Jones video game at the time, like right around 2005, 2006. And they were looking for a composer. And a friend of mine from USC, Jesse Harlan, we went to USC program together, was working there as well. And he said, man, somebody from, the audio department just sent me this video. Is this you? And I'm like, yeah, that's me. He's like, oh my God, we're trying to find a guy for this Indiana Jones thing, but it's not working out. Would you be willing to let me use this as a demo? And so he sent it to all the powers that be, and everyone liked it. And that's how I ended up getting hired for my first video game score, was because of this Ryan versus Dorkman thing. And
subsequent to that also, wasn't there a period of time where he would also bring you in to orchestrate his stuff that he was doing for those as well?
That happened after I had done that game.
Right.
Once I started getting more, of an understanding of scoring games, and, Jesse and I we're still friends, but now we were officially working together in that capacity. Right. And so, yeah, I actually, because of the Indiana Jones thing, is how I landed on Star Wars: The Old Republic, which was also LucasArts at the time. And then there was another Star Wars game, Star Wars 1313, which is like the most cursed Star Wars game of all time.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's been made and canceled and made and canceled so many times. I've lost count, honestly. But one of those was a score that Jesse had written, and I orchestrated all the music for him.
Right.
And like went as far as like we, flew to London and recorded it with the London Symphony, and I conducted. It was my first time conducting like a symphony of that size.
I didn't realize that 1313 had been recorded. I know that there was a few sort of Died on the Vine. Yeah. I remember First Assault was another one that I think was also fully recorded and produced. Yep. But I didn't realize 1313 was musically effectively done or close to it.
It was in the can. They just pulled the plug on the whole project, but the score was part of the score at least was already recorded, probably a couple hours worth. I'm not sure how much music was going to ultimately end up in the game, but we did about 2 hours of music. And the stuff Jesse wrote was like super cool, and it just sits in a warehouse somewhere. Like I'm picturing like end of
Raiders.
Like, yeah, exactly. Just boxes of scores hidden away.
Yep.
But so it's kind of a shame because it's some pretty cool stuff that he did. We had fun with that. But yeah, I mean, that sort of, doing the Old Republic led to me doing actually what ended up happening. And I'll backtrack a bit. So I did Old Republic, and then shortly after the 1313 thing, which immediately followed that, was canceled. It was because Disney had purchased Star Wars and Lucasfilm, and the whole like acquisition happened. Yep. And so LucasArts shut their door, and that's what closed the lid on 1313.
Yeah.
And then for about, I'd say, a year, it was kind of like, very unstable ground. Like, oh man, I had this great relationship with this developer, this game studio. But they were the only game studio I'd worked for. And so now I have to like kind of go out there and try to use this as a calling card for, the games. And it was a struggle for about a year. And somehow or another, I ended up landing on this Microsoft game. It was another Star Wars game, and which made it easy because I had a good Star Wars demo for the Kinect system that had just come out. So I did the Star Wars Kinect game. That was sort of like a little interim game that I did that was Star Wars. And then eventually EA sort of acquired a 10-year license, I guess, to do Star Wars games.
Right.
And I had to, in a way, like throw my name in the hat with every other composer that wanted to work on their first game, which was Star Wars Battlefront. And I was hoping that, my sort of like street cred of having done Star Wars games up to that point would have helped. But it was like, no, they just went right to the, to the very beginning, back to the drawing board, and just like took demos from everyone, and actually did like a blind listening test to choose their composer, which I thought was kind of fascinating. And they narrowed it down to a few, and I was one of them. And I remember Steve Schnurr calling me, who's the head of music at EA. He calls me up, and I've never met him, certainly never received a call from him. I knew who he was. And he said, you don't know me, but I just got back from Sweden. I'm at the airport right now. I met with the studio there. They want to hire you for this Star Wars game. I don't think that you wrote the music that they say you wrote. We need to meet."
Oh man, that's so very him.
It is totally. And I can say this in complete confidence because he'll tell the exact same story. He loves telling the story. And so literally, like, he landed from Sweden where he had gone to convince them to hire Bill Ross, but they were really keen on hiring me because they wanted someone that understood games and they liked the music I had sent over.
And for any listener unfamiliar, Bill Ross is like a close collaborator with John Williams. You know, somebody you can't really get closer without just hiring John Williams, basically.
Spare, yeah. Bill's amazing, and but you know, in this case, I got kind of lucky, I guess. And you know, Steve hops off this plane, calls me up, and says, "Can you meet me at the Coffee Bean in 1 hour? I'll be there in 1 hour. Meet me there." You know, so I hop in my car and drive across town, and like, this could be an opportunity. And I meet with this guy, and we just hit it off instantly. We spent like 3 hours, and it never even really came up what the music for this thing, the needs of the game were. We never.
How much did you know about the game? Obviously, a lot of times we're really kept in the dark, especially I would think for something this, you know, a new Star Wars game under the new regime. Like, you must have been held at arm's length for quite a while.
Very much so. In fact, like, even after that whole meet and greet and him sort of validating and you know, verifying that I was the person that said I was, and that I had written the music I had sent them, and you know, and we had this really great, you know, time. We got to be friends pretty quickly. Even then, I wasn't flat out hired. I still got put through the ringer a little bit. He essentially decided, let's hire Gordy to write 10 minutes of music as sort of a test. So basically like a paid 10-minute spec.
Right.
You know, here's some music from the game that we want to use, you know, from John Williams that we want to use. We want you to write the B-side to this A-side of John Williams, and it's the music from Tatooine. We want you to continue the sound of Tatooine for another 10 minutes. Show us what you got. You got a week, you know? And so I spent like a week writing this thing and doing this demo and, you know, putting it all together and recording some parts and, you know, mixing and whatever. And that's ultimately how I ended up getting hired for Battlefront.
So somewhere in the middle of all of that, I remember I got called to throw my hat in the ring on a game, which was a Walking Dead game. And then I later found out that they had hired you.
Yeah.
And I remember going, the Star Wars guy, because we had never met at any point, because that would have been before all this, right? That this was an Activision.
It would be before Battlefront.
Right.
But after Star Wars Connect, because, oh my God, I'm going to blank out on the developer's name who made the Walking Dead game. They don't exist anymore. They were based in Austin.
Yeah, I never knew them. I was dealing with people from Activision who were running the composer, you know, refereeing that process.
Well, it was the same developer that made the Star Wars Connect game. So the music director was the same guy.
That's
so that's how I ended up getting on that game. You know how it works.
Yeah, absolutely.
I had a lot of fun on that game, by the way, too, which nobody ever heard or probably played.
Yeah, it was actually one of those where I remember not thinking the game had come out, and then I saw it on your credit sheet at some point later and was like, I guess it did come out. And
I had fun with that, man. I went to like my old like bluegrass roots from growing up in Virginia, like dug deep into like
awesome.
fiddle playing and stuff like that. It was a lot of fun, actually. And you know, I paid some like homage to Bear's score from the series and played around with his themes. And Bear and I went to school together, and we've been friends forever too. So
I remember he was in that same class, right?
He was.
You and Jesse.
He was in the same class with Jesse and I. Yeah.
Yeah. So something else that I'm curious about that I know is I remember. Wasn't there some crossroad where Chance Thomas?
Oh, yes. I cannot leave Chance out of this. Yeah, I know exactly where you're going.
I couldn't quite remember. I just know that I did one of these with him recently where I basically just sat there going, "Are you really retiring? Because is that even allowed?" And he was like, "I'm done, man." And it was basically just an hour and a half of me going, "Really?"
Are you sure?
But I always think of him as one of the most kind of graciously supportive and generous of his colleagues type guys. And I thought exactly that before I heard your story, which blew my mind as like, okay, that's on a whole other level. So what was the story there again? Because
so this is pre Steve Schnurr landing and calling me into a meeting and getting hired for Battlefront. There was a period of time where everyone was submitting their demos to DICE. To Ben Mento was the music director at DICE, audio director, and he was taking demos for this Star Wars project. And everyone submitted. Myself, for all I know, you submitted. I have no idea, but Chance Thomas.
Actually, funny enough, I can answer that. I remember Kraft Angle calling me and said, EA is looking for composers on a big new Star Wars thing. And I said, let me ask a question. Are they looking for John Williams, like extremely faithful, or are they interested in expanding? Because I said, to be honest, I don't know that I'm that interested in, or even necessarily that I want to potentially put myself out there as even capable of as a full-on sort of B-side. I said that's a thing that, I given enough time, I'd like to believe I have the wherewithal to be able to do that. But I can appreciate from the jump that that's not a trivial task, and it's not that appealing of a task for me. So I said, here's the deal. I had just done. Task. Oh, yeah. Well, that's a whole other dimension to it. But I had just finished this game called the Banner Saga, which had big, very brassy orchestral, or actually technically it's wind ensemble music. And I said, tell you what, send them that, and then we'll never hear from them again. And that's exactly what happened. Because I said, it's not John Williams-esque at all, but yeah, they were just soliciting reels to find out who to ask to demo. And I said, they're not going to ask me to demo because this is nothing like Star Wars music, but at least that way you can sleep at night knowing. Because my agent was like, well, we got to submit, it's Star Wars. And I was like, well, okay, you submit this, and then we can predict the outcome.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, like you, so many of us submitted, and Chance Thomas was one of those people that submitted. But with his submission, he also included an email saying, and I'm kind of summarizing, but this is the short of it. I would love nothing more than to write the music for Star Wars Battlefront, a legendary series, and I'm a huge fan of the music it comes from. But there's this guy, Gordy Haab, who does this so well, you really should consider him before you consider anyone else. And another composer submitting for the same project went above and beyond to let the audio director know that I was somebody that should fast forward to the top of the list. And I was, because of that, fast forwarded to the top of the list. I've confirmed after the fact with Ben Mento that was the reason that he put my demo to the top and listened to it and actually considered me. And so I can't imagine many other people doing something like that. That was like,
it's not even many, it's
coolest things.
It's no one. I mean,
nobody does that.
It is. And I don't even think it's because people are naturally so like vampirically selfish that they just refuse to think of somebody else. It's just, you can't forgive, you can easily forgive people looking out for number one, so to speak, in a competitive industry. You're living freelance, on some level or another. You're kind of living job by job, or hopefully not paycheck to paycheck, but it can get quite close to that pretty easily. And so and knowing the potential consequences of landing a job like this, to say something like that bespeaks a level of character and genuineness. Like the idea that he would say, from his point of view, I am valuing the quality of the final product above everything else, and this is somebody who I think can deliver that beyond even myself. And if you care about the final product, that should be the criteria with which you view it, all my personal ambitions aside. And he's not an unambitious guy at all.
Oh, I know. Exactly. I mean, he's like the kind of guy that would go after that job, wholeheartedly and put everything into it to get it, So the fact that he did that is not only just shows, so much character, but it's just, I don't know. I mean, that's like one of the coolest things anyone's ever really done for me in this industry in many ways, because it really did.
It's one of the coolest things anyone has done for anyone ever.
I mean, that's fair, man. I mean, I love this guy to the end of time. I mean, he's a sweetheart, and he did something that, like we say, nobody else would ever do. And it really did aid in me getting that job. If it wasn't like the main catalyst that got the job, it certainly was a big factor. And
it would seem to me that it
launched
opened the door. You had to ultimately show up with the goods to walk through the door, but he kind of wedged it open in a way that you might have been very difficult or hard pressed to do on your own.
Exactly. That's it. I mean, it's that whole luck is just opportunity meets preparation kind of thing. But, the luck in my case was Chance Thomas jumping in there and saying something so kind like that.
How did he know? What was the prior relationship?
Well, he had heard the music I did for Star Wars Connect, and I had submitted it for like a gang award or something like that. And so he was reviewing those, and like he came up to me at GDC one year after I'd wrapped that score and said, "Man, I've never heard anyone write Star Wars music like John Williams, to the point where I actually thought it was John Williams. And man, you really have this thing down." And, I guess it just stuck in his head that I was like the cat that could do that thing if needed. And it impressed him, I guess. And, enough so that he was willing to like really stick his neck out like that. That was pretty amazing.
Truly.
It was. And you're right in many ways. You were saying earlier about like the idea of like, do I want to do something where I have to do the B-side to John Williams? Is that like the look I'm after? Is that like, the hill you want to die on, in a sense? Because it's not just that you have to do that thing, which means that you have to put your own aesthetic sort of to the side for a minute. Mm-hmm. And of course, try to like bring yourself into it as well. But like, there is at the end of the day a huge parameter around what you're writing, a
but parameter also, that like 100 million people are going to have opinions on.
That's the biggest part. It's like, not only, am I potentially pigeonholing myself, but if I'm successful at this, I'm pigeonholing myself. But at the worst, I'm going to piss off an entire fan base for the biggest film franchise of all time. And how's that going to look? So there was a ton of pressure to like deliver what they were asking for, which was like, hey, we want original music, no themes from John Williams, but we want it to be as though John Williams himself wrote it. So you need to get into his head and figure out how he works and write your own original themes, but it needs to feel like he could have done it. And so for Battlefront 1, that was 100% the assignment. Yeah. And what I signed up for and what I committed myself to for a good part of a year. It wasn't until Battlefront 2 where I actually went back to the table and said, hey, now that we've done this thing, and it was successful, and the score was extremely well received, I would love nothing more than to branch away from trying to be the B-side to John Williams, but let's write an original score for this game that has nothing to do with that. I mean, it still needs to feel Star Wars, but I'd like to do my own thing on this. And that was Battlefront 2. And that's where I really started feeling like I took that franchise and sort of stretching it out a little bit, kind of pushing it forward, stamping it a bit more with my own aesthetic. And, not to say that Battlefront 1 was not me, because it certainly was. I mean, like that, the music of John Williams is like a part of my DNA, because like I grew up with it, like many of us. It's what inspired me to do this thing in the first place. But
I also think I think when I look back at my initial, it sounds smug to say turning my nose up at the prospect of having my hat in the ring, but I just found myself going, I really loathe the thought of the only way that this job goes well is to fully be somebody else. And that really rubbed me the wrong way. And as time has gone by, I've come to realize that I probably was having a very ego-centric reaction, because there's a few things that have come up over the last decade or however long since then that because first off, when I heard what you did, it was because this was a whole other level when I heard it compared to the older public, and like it was just it was like, it really was just, holy shit, this isn't just John Williams. It's not John Williams emulation. It's John Williams grade. It's John Williams caliber, which is such a narrow and mind-bogglingly difficult target to hit with any kind of authenticity, but it didn't just sound like John Williams, because we had also around that time started to hear new Star Wars music from John Williams. Right. And there was a real difference. I like everybody else, I worship the guy. I'm seeing him this weekend at the Bowl. I'm so grateful that, you know, there's a new Indiana Jones out. We still get to hear new John Williams music. Totally. You know, at 91, he still matters a lot to me. But when you listen to how he was writing in his 40s and his 50s versus how he's writing in his 80s and his 90s, there was a fire in the belly. When you listen to Empire Strikes Back or E.T., you're like, this guy was fucking just
going for it, man. Everything. Yeah. It was like his shot.
When I heard the Battlefront, I said, this isn't John Williams in some abstract sense. This is like John Williams when he was like in the 80s, you know, when he was really going nuts. And then I had that voice in my head at some point that reminded me, if you ask John Williams about his style, he points to Close Encounters.
Yeah, exactly.
And he says, like, Star Wars isn't really my thing. And I realized a lot of this is probably, I need to be a little bit more sort of Zen and sort of Buddhist about all this, I think. Because there's also just the bigger, not that this is a confessional of regret or anything. Because like I said, when I heard what you did, I thought, oh, I couldn't have done that. This found the right person. Like it, you know, and that's only been reaffirmed. You know, I felt that way all the more strongly when playing Fallen Order. Cause it was like, fuck, man, this is really this. I like this better than quite a lot of Star Wars music. So yeah, anyway, it was, I dismissed it as, oh, you just have to go copy somebody else. And that's also really hard. And like, I really overlooked a lot of virtue, and also what it says about being able to actually do that is a tremendous compliment. And so, yeah.
Well, I appreciate that. And I'll be honest, like when I approached it, you know, Battlefront in particular, because I knew it was a solo act, you know, on Old Republic, there was a team of composers and we had like, it was set in a different time period in the Star Wars universe. So we could get away with things being a little, not quite like the original scores. But this was like, you know, Battlefront was meant to be like, you open up that shoebox in your attic and there's all your Star Wars toys from the 70s and, you know, and you're playing with those things. So it needed to fit with that same aesthetic. But, you know, I saw sort of two options. It's like, I can either do like pastiche and do imitation of John Williams, or I can do me, but do it through the lens of like all that music that I love of his. And just, you know, so essentially what I ended up doing was like, I need to, in some weird way, become John Williams for this project.
I mean,
I don't want to do a sound alike. I don't want people to be like, oh, I can listen to that, you know, piece of music and I can tell that you were listening to this piece of music when you wrote it. I didn't want that. I wanted to boil all of Star Wars down, absorb it, and then put it away and never look at it again and just write a score, which is exactly what I did. Like I never looked at a score of his during the entire time I was scoring it. I never listened to Star Wars music while I was working on it. I felt that would be like I felt that I'd be like very tempted to be like, oh, I just want to do one like that. I like that.
Yeah. It's like little kind of tips of the hat to this riff or that little
and gesture. If you do that, it's kind of like, well, why do that when that already exists and the original is always going to be better? So, you know, why would I want to do an imitation? You
said it so brilliantly that I never really thought of it. That all these scores, and with all respect to the various folks who've tried to do this over the years for various projects, it never really. It always felt like someone trying to emulate John Williams as opposed to becoming John Williams. And I think that it might sound just kind of like fluffy kind of platitude language, but I think there is something to that as to why your stuff's just so much more successfully just embodied it without, I had never really appreciated that until this moment, that you're not actually sort of cribbing moments in order to remind us that it's Star Wars. Exactly. Which even he has fallen into, like the new Indiana Jones, straight up quoting the tank cue from Last Crusade or whatever, right in the middle of the thing, where I kind of thought, okay, I get it that through this, you know, as an audience member, I'm supposed to go, oh, okay, I remember that, or I feel that feels familiar, or whatever. But I thought he doesn't. Who's he trying to prove? You know, like he must have been talked into that because.
Yep. I'm sure that's a big part of it, you know. I mean, I heard like little elements of like War of the Worlds in there sometimes too. Like, and when I saw it last weekend, it's like, oh yeah, he's pulling from his little bag of tricks.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh yeah, the Tintin.
I mean, it's always still brilliant, but you know, he's definitely digging into his bag.
There was an almost Horner level lift of the Tintin fencing bit in Indiana Jones as well that I thought, and it's one of those where I can hardly complain because I'm just thrilled he's alive and writing music. Like I'm like, he can do whatever the fuck he wants. You know, I will be thrilled. I will weep tears of joy. But I do notice, can't help it.
Yeah. It's hard not to notice. I picked up on a couple of those things. I mean, you know, look, it was like, I saw two roads and then a potential middle path. It's like either I go here where I do imitation of John Williams, you know, to the point where you can like pinpoint like, oh, I see what you're doing there. That's just that cue, but you kind of did this, you change the melody, use the same chords, whatever, that kind of thing. That would have resulted in an audience absolutely destroying me for just being a rip-off artist, you know. Or I go completely original. I do Gordy's take on this thing and I ignore everything that John Williams has done up to a certain point. I do that, I get destroyed. So the only answer is to find some sort of middle path. And the middle path to me was to not imitate, but become, you know, the sound of Star Wars. And I remember doing a talk on it at like a GDC or something like that after Battlefront 1 to come out, talking about my process. And I sort of equated it to, you know, it's like I had two options. I could do a paint by numbers. You know what I mean? Here's a Star Wars paint by numbers thing. And, you know, you fill in that every time you see, you know, like A, you put in blue or whatever. Or
B flat is blue.
B flat's always blue. Or I could say, why don't I just use the same palette of colors that John Williams used? Completely blank canvas is my own canvas, is my own artwork. I'm just using the same color palette as he would use. And that was the comparison I made, and that was the choice I chose. And I think it ultimately worked out because you know, the response was positive from the fan base. You know, I mean, like you occasionally get someone that's like, oh, I can see that sounds just like that. And if you go listen, it's like nothing like it at all. I mean, I think people hear something and they just imagine it's like something else because it's Star Wars, but you know,
no, I think that's a perfect way to approach it. And it's worth highlighting that using that palette is deeper than just what one might assume you mean by that. Like, oh, it's the orchestra configured this way or whatever, because it's a sensibility where one can just intuit, you know, the phrase reaches its end in a certain way and the harmonies have these kinds of voicings typically. Like he has his bag of tricks, but it's not just the trick on the surface level. It's how he's thinking about line and tension and release and all of that. And that's the stuff that became your palette. I know that you obviously know this. I'm just saying it for the sake of our listeners that it's tempting to assume when you say color palette that it means like the orchestration.
He used trumpets, so I want to use trumpets. Or no, it's not like that at all. It's like
a philosophical palette.
Exactly right.
Yeah. I think that, and boy, did you. I know it sounds like I'm just sort of frothing at the mouth, sort of just bending over backwards, but I'm really just in such awe, especially considering, I remember at some point you said that you've written considerably more Star Wars music than John Williams has at this point.
That is 100% the fact now. There were times where I was like, I think I'm pretty close, but now, I think I'm somewhere in the range of like 80 hours or something like that, music written for Star Wars, you know, all of it like and all like recorded, you know, with the full orchestra and the whole deal. So it's like it's pretty vast, you know. It's kind of an honor to get to have done that. I mean, that's pretty cool to think. I mean,
he talks about how, you know, having scored 9 films and you know, a couple little like the Obi-Wan theme and a few other little ancillary bits.
So that gets you about maybe 18 to 20 hours worth of
I was gonna say 20 if you kind of generously round up and assume that certain that we know there were things that were recorded and then ultimately not used and that sort of thing. That's a quarter of what
Kind of
we're
crazy to
talking
think
about. I
about.
mean, it's
Yeah.
it,
And of
yeah,
course, quantity over quality is not exactly what I was after either. But so like I tried to make sure every single minute of those 80 whatever hours were up to the fan base standards, because I'm a member of that fan base. So I always was writing to, at a certain point I had to like figure out how I was going to cope with that fan pressure
yeah,
while I'm working on this, because it's pretty overwhelming to think that if I went this way, like I was talking about before, or this way, I basically get completely killed and could ruin my career.
yeah,
Or I had to find this path. And the path for me was, well, I just need to, who are the fans? Who am I writing for? Well, I'm a fan. So what would I want to hear? I
right,
wouldn't want to hear rehashing of old John Williams stuff. I'd
right,
want to hear new music. But if it didn't fit Star Wars, I'd be disappointed too. So I had to find the thing that I felt I personally, as a fan, would want to hear and focus on that. And so that was like sort of that's how I coped with the fear of that vast fan base that was sort of like looming over, always, not to even mention the Lucasfilms and the Disneys and
So okay,
even
actually,
John Williams.
that was exactly. So I was waiting to mention that I remember us doing a panel at some point together, and you mentioned that at least in the early days, you had to send all these cues. Like obviously, there's going to be a boatload of approvals from all the various executives
Course,
and
yeah.
publisher people and Lucas and brand people, like IP steward type people. But John Williams himself had to approve or listen to your cues,
Yep.
at least in the early days, right? Like
in the early days for Battlefront 1, that was the case. So for Battlefront 1, everything first gets approved by DICE, the developing company making the game, and then it would be sent to Lucasfilm. And we had a 6-week approval process where Lucasfilm would have, or Lucasfilm, it wasn't Lucasfilm Games at the time, but it was just Lucasfilm's music department. So they would listen for 2 weeks. If they signed off, it would go over to Disney's music department. They'd have 2 weeks. And then the final 2 weeks, it would go to John Williams, and he'd have 2 weeks to listen and sign off on things. And so it was like always, everything had to be done 6 weeks in advance of anything, because it's such a long approval process. And if at any point along that chain, somebody had notes, it would get kicked back and the whole process would start again. So it was a lot of oversight. I mean, I won over ultimately, like after a while, after like kind of nailing a few cues and making everyone happy, sort of figured out what was working for everyone.
Right.
It got a lot easier as I went.
Did you ever get feedback back from Williams that like
just twice, only 2 times. And one of the times was simply because it was a moment where if I did not use the Force theme, it would have been wrong for what it was for. So I folded in his Force theme into something that I'd already written. It's my music, but like kind of like wove it in there, like almost like a counterline. And his thought was that that's just not a counterline melody. That melody either needs to be featured or not in there. And that seemed fair.
Yeah, so, I mean, it's probably the most well-known melody. It's, I guess, a toss-up between that and the Imperial March, which is the most famous thing he's ever written. Exactly. So I can appreciate the kind of tell Mr. DeMille I'm ready for my close-up attitude about it.
Exactly. And it totally made sense. And I got that. It's like, yeah, that is a featured melody. Let's not, give it a back seat. And so I, altered that. And then there was another time where actually, just thinking forward here, this was for an expansion for Battlefront 1 where we did the Force Awakens material, because the Force Awakens came out shortly after Battlefront 1 released. And then we did some DLC content, and part of it was like some of the characters from Force Awakens, and I had written some music and got notes back from Lucas saying that, well, the sound of the Force Awakens is a bit different than the original scores for Star Wars. It needs to fit that more, but the movie wasn't out. It was still 6 months out before the film would come out. So I'm like, well, how am I supposed to fit alongside a score that I'm not allowed to hear because it's still, either being written or certainly they're not going to share it with me. And so I found a way to kind of get it over the finish line regardless. But on Battlefront 2, that was a big talking point before I started that project. I said, if I'm going to do any expansions that are based on films that have not come out yet, like, for example, Rogue One. I would like a chance to at least hear the music that you're trying to have me fit alongside of. So with Rogue One, I actually like ended up getting like a little private screening of the film, like,
Nice.
about 8 months before it came out, and got to hear a bit of the original score, which is not Giacchino's score. It was Alexander Despot's score.
Oh, I didn't realize that it had ever made it to a point of.
Yeah, I mean, it was in there as like as temp at very early stages.
It must have been completely different.
So different. Yeah, so different. And ultimately, like, that sound wouldn't have worked for what I was doing, so we ended up kind of abandoning that sound, and I just kind of did.
So did they.
Thing. Yeah, I know. Exactly. So, but it was kind of interesting because, like, for a while they were saying we needed to sound just like blah, but you're not allowed to hear blah.
Right.
So, we have to fix that if we're going to do it that way. Which kind of led to a lot of creative decisions on Battlefront 2, where it was like, you know what, do we really need, like, we've sort of proven that we can do nostalgia here. Why don't we stretch out a little bit and, do like a whole bunch of original new themes? We had a story mode in that game. There was like a campaign focused on an original character that was, now part of canon, but like at the time, I mean, it was just in the game. And so that was an opportunity to essentially like write Gordy's version of Star Wars in a way. And that's what I did. And, that sort of like laid the groundwork for a lot of like the sound that I had kind of developed for myself in that franchise that I expanded most upon in the Jedi series. So Fallen Order is certainly like my furthest diversion from the John Williams sound. And then, Survivor even more so.
Yeah.
Like I really
absolutely
went a lot of Stephen and I, my composing partner on that, we decided from the very beginning that, John Williams was not necessarily going to be our main influence for this score, because there's so many composers contributing to Star Wars at this point, that it kind of gives us the, sort of freedom to kind of like put our own stamp on it. So where do we take this? It's like, well, let's go back to the original thing that inspired John Williams rather than going to John Williams. So, I mean, he was listening to, romantic era, classical repertoire and like, neo-romantic stuff. And, so instead of like trying to do John Williams, what we did is just, we dug into those like sources and that inspiration and like use that more as like our foundation, but put it through like sort of a modern spin by like the inclusion of a lot of, electroacoustic processing and addition of like synths and getting Alan Ryerson to mix it. And, and just, we kind of went nuts with it. So it's quite a bit of fun.
Something else along the lines of having to get the approvals of Williams, and how that whole thing is fascinating to me, because I just think he's probably really not. He would be listening to mock-ups, and he's probably not very accustomed to listening to mock-ups. He doesn't live in our world. He kind of lives in the clouds, and he's not Mr. Technology, and so
exactly.
Mock-ups to him are just gonna sound like shitty. Like no matter, it could be the best mock-up in the world, and mock-ups also it wouldn't matter. And on top of that, sample libraries are so catered to essentially the opposite aesthetic of him.
Exactly.
They're so built for like that trailer wall of sound, remote control kind of vibe, that the mock-ups must have been a little dodgy,
pretty janky. Yeah. I mean, hands off to Sam Smythe, who's been working on my team forever, and for the Battlefront scores, he did all the mock-ups. I mean, I wrote everything by hand.
That was going to be actually the next thing I went to is in that same vein. You had mentioned you wanted to kind of duplicate the process, and I think that's so awesome. But what an undertaking to then say, I'm going to write by hand, have to hand it off to somebody to reconstruct from a mock-up. I mean, what a labor-intensive process.
It really was. I mean, it was a very labor-intensive process that is not completely repeatable on projects moving forward. But for Battlefront, it made sense because I had to become John Williams, as I was saying. So how would John Williams do this thing then? He would sit at the piano and he'd write it on a 9-stave sketch. And so that's actually how I wrote the entire score. And so I would scan that, send it to Sam, and he'd do mock-ups from that. And that's what would get approved. And once that was approved, I could take his mock-ups and export the MIDI into notation and orchestrate from there. It was almost like, when we were negotiating, like, deal points in the contract for Battlefront and, like, budget lines. There was a line for orchestration, and I said, rather than us hiring an orchestrator, I'd rather hire myself as the orchestrator and take a large percentage of that orchestration budget and put it into hiring someone to, like, full-time do mock-ups for me so that I can write the way John Williams would write.
Yeah.
And ultimately, I think that was, like, sort of the recipe that made it successful, because I don't think I could have written a score like that writing straight to sequencer, because it would be so maddening to hear how terrible it was that I would probably make decisions to try to make it sound better.
Yeah, that's the thing. That's also probably part of why when I heard it, it felt on another level. It's not just I'm a believer that a composer, it's coming from within. So it shouldn't matter what your tool is. It shouldn't matter whether it's pen and paper, but you're not wrong that there is a certain feedback loop of, you hear the sample struggling to make the French horns do that. So you give it to something else because you're like, well, it's got to get approved and whatever. And, like, we make these little negotiations, even unconsciously, all the time. And those things would have, even if it was the equivalent of periodic little pinpricks, it would have been death by 1,000 cuts, that it would have aggregated into a thing that wouldn't have had that level of authenticity. And I knew you wrote it by hand, and I always thought that was awesome, but I hadn't actually appreciated the psychological impact of the act of making the mock-up on interfering with that process. And I think I think you were, how did you arrive at this proposal? I mean, that's not an intuitive thing in a video game hiring discussion to go, I'd like to write by hand.
Yeah, I know, exactly. I mean, honestly, because when I did that little 10-minute spec, I did kind of everything. So I'd sketch a little bit by hand, then I'd go straight into notation, then I'd export that and build the mock-up from that. And I would spend, like, maybe 2 hours writing a little snippet of music and another 8 hours trying to make it sound good with samples.
Right.
And I just thought to myself, man, if I do this job and it's like, 4 or 5 hours of music, I'm going to be here until, like 2030 trying to write this score. If I'm doing it like this, it's just going to take forever.
So what made you then, instead of rejecting the write by hand, which would have been most people's instinct in that, to go, well, I guess this is not going to be practical.
Yep.
What gave you the kind of courage to do the opposite?
So Sam, who works with me, I gave him sort of, in that moment, I kind of gave him a test case. So I was like, here is a sketch, do a mock-up. I want to see how quickly you get it done. And he had it done, like, something that would have taken me the whole day. It was done, like, in a couple hours. And it was convincing enough for me to understand that the music was going to work. It didn't sound like what I wanted it to sound like, because it's very difficult to mock up that type of music. Actually, it's impossible, really, to mock up, like, truly symphonic music with samples, because the samples just don't do that thing well. They're not designed to do that. It's like you said, they're designed for, like, this big wall of sound, what the current trend in, like, sort of, Hollywood movies is.
Well, and also the samples do well with, generally speaking, fast attacks and quick decays, so
exactly.
Works great, piano works great, spiccato strings work great. Anything that's a little bite-sized Lego block of sound will work well. And that's, like, the opposite of John Williams, which is this florid, expressive, everything connects. There's never any of this blockiness. And so it's sort of, like, cursed from the mock-up standpoint.
And I think because Sam was a bit detached from the, like, my creative process of having written it, that he was able just to get a mock-up out and not worry about every little detail. I mean, of course he does worry about to make sure it's as good as possible. But, like, for me, I would just sit there and manipulate the thing to death because it wasn't sounding like what I wanted it to sound like. And so I think sort of detaching myself from that process, and him being sort of detached from my creative side process, made it so that he could just do it fast. I would give everything one listen, and in most cases I would kind of cringe, but I'd just send it. It's like, as a mock-up stands, it's very good for what it was. You know what I mean? But like, I knew that, that could never be the end product. You know what I mean? So, but I was able just to sort of separate myself from it and be like, well, this is just sort of a, it's exactly what it says it is. It's a mock-up. It's a model of what is to be. It's a sketch. It's like a line drawing of a painting. So as long as it was enough to get everyone to sign off on it, then it was going to work perfectly for my process. So, but if I had done them myself, I feel like I would have just like manipulated them to death until it got to the point where it sounded like what I was after, and I would have wasted so much time doing that for just something that you ultimately throw away at the end of the day. We were recording everything.
That's the thing. I've always had a similar relationship with samples where if I can't later record it, I don't really like to use it. And so the result is that my mock-ups have never sounded as good as most other people's, because they've never had to replace something. Like I've basically made it kind of a little bit of a quasi dogmatic rule. Because it's just, plus it's more interesting creative challenge. If they can't afford a big orchestra, you're looking for something different, then you go, okay, then we won't have to worry about any of that then.
Exactly. Yeah.
The problem solved.
And I would write completely differently in a situation like that than I would for a Star Wars series. I mean, if I know that the end product is going to be something that's all in my studio, then I would write to the capabilities of the tools I have rather than write to the capability of an orchestra and then try to figure out how to make it sound like an orchestra, So, and I've done plenty of projects like that, where, the end goal is mostly sampled, or maybe I sweeten it with a few things, but like, I just make sure that what I'm writing works and sounds good no matter what the end result is. If the end result is supposed to be like all sampled, then I need to make sure that I'm writing it so the samples sound good. Yeah. But that wasn't the assignment here. So, I knew that these were just placeholders just to get the point across.
That assignment would have been antithetical to the Star Wars sound anyway, because
it would have been.
Like you can't have both. Either write to the strength of the samples or sound like Star Wars, but you're never. You can't have both. And how many fucking movie trailers have come out for the various movies that prove this point, where there's just this painful, very obviously sample. Blah blah blah, na, 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 and you're like, that sounds awful. And it's this is a real trailer for like a major $200 million movie.
Right.
It's wild.
It is. I mean, it just proves the point that particular franchise calls for a certain thing, and that certain thing is a symphonic orchestra. Now, I mean, what we did with Jedi Survivor is it still features a symphonic orchestra, but then we also have now added in, layers and layers of other, sources, like with synths and, electronics and that kind of thing, but even then it's like the goal
and novel,
to make them integrated,
Yeah.
It's a layer. It's like
it felt like the palette was expanding, not shifting.
Right.
Which I liked. I really like when you land on the kind of desert planet and there's this sort of like duduk trio. Where it was like,
it is actually a duduk trio.
Well, I figured, because I immediately called Kristen Nagus and I was like, is this you? And she was like, yes. But I was like, this is a perfect example where it felt Star Warsy, but yet there's no Star Wars cue you could point to that's remotely like that, actually. So it was like that's, and I'd always hoped Star Wars could go that route. Like I like that sort of they've had their cage rattled a little bit in the form of things like Andor that have said, like, here's something that's just fundamentally, essentially not Star Warsy at all. Mm-hmm. And you've accepted it, made your peace with it. I personally really loved it, but I can appreciate that I loved it while acknowledging that it's really not like Star Wars.
Totally. But that's what makes it work in a way, because
especially for that
series itself has a different feeling.
Yeah, I mean, it would never have worked on anything other than what that show was, I think, and it would have felt if you'd had a score like that in a Rogue One, even, which is still Tony Gilroy's, you know, at the helm of it on some level,
right?
Even that wouldn't have quite worked. This was such a rejection of all the traditional Star Wars isms, sort of across the board, that but as part of the ecosystem, saying these are all Star Wars, to give space, in a sense, to make less to make more risk averse executives who would potentially be breathing down your neck back off and let you do stuff that expands that palette. You certainly felt the dividends of that being paid in Jedi Survivor, which was awesome. So
that's cool.
And culminating in a grand Hollywood Bowl LA Phil performance.
That's right. Which
not too shabby.
Fantastic. Pretty cool moment there, getting to see that happen. You know, I mean, and what's interesting, even on that concert, like one of the main themes that we featured from our score was an interesting story, because, you know, it goes back to, like, it's always about what fits for that particular project, because not all Star Wars music will fit all Star Wars projects. And in this case, we have a very different storyline. We have different characters. It's in a different time period in the franchise. And there was a need for an Imperial theme, but right. The Imperial theme from John Williams, the Imperial March, was wrong for the context that it was in. It needed to be something that was more sort of ominous and you know, felt like it was omnipresent, you know, sort of in the distance and, you know, haunting in some strange way, rather than being like a march that's very insistent, like, here, we're bearing down on you. This is more like, it's the Empire is always out there, and as Cal, you know, you're sort of like kind of hiding from it. You're trying to escape it, but it's around every corner. So we had to kind of come up with a Imperial theme that felt like it was sort of like, you know, worming its way through the storyline. And
that is an interesting.
But of course, it had to be memorable as well, which is like another, you know, one of my favorite buzzwords is like, write a memorable theme, you know, because I have a firm belief that what makes a theme memorable, beyond just good melody writing, is repetition. It's like, the more you hear it, it will become memorable.
Well, and also
to remember a theme the first time you hear it, no matter what it is.
I agree. There's very, very few that can achieve that. And Williams has always been very good at looking for every conceivable opportunity in these films to feature those themes. Yep. Like he's got a real gift, and they're made. They're made, you know, kind of with those landing spots in mind. You know, especially Spielberg has a tendency to kind of like create, you know, here's a 30-second window where this footage is basically in service of the theme, not the other way around. And, you know, think about like Jurassic Park, just how indulgent the arrival to the island sequence is, where it's not really telling the story, but yet there's a belief that if we let the music stretch out, that actually will help tell the story. Totally. So it's a gift for collaboration that most filmmakers don't.
It really is.
Don't have.
And you know, as a composer, I'm sure you've heard this many times too, where people ask for, when they're asking for a memorable melody, but they ask for a singable melody.
Yeah, right.
And I have this belief that for a melody to be strong and memorable, it does not necessarily have to be singable, because I challenge anyone to sing the entire Imperial March theme top to bottom.
Right. Yeah, the whole B section is pretty.
Because that B section's out there, man. It's angular. It's all over the place.
Yeah,
like, even I cannot do it pitch for pitch. You know, like, if you were to put me on the spot and sing it. So I don't believe singable is actually what makes memorable. So I kind of almost as like a
Williams, actually virtually all of his melodies
are angular, like,
because you think of there's so many you think of James Horner, who so many of his themes then culminated in a end credit pop song version of the theme.
Right.
Everyone knows
diatonic. They're easy to sing because they're diatonic, or you know.
And they're relatively narrow range, although not always. I always think of his Land Before Time, the Diana Ross song. That's like, it's like a freaking 2-octave melody. But
it's true. That's a good point.
But generally speaking, you know, you think of My Heart Will Go On and the Avatar one, or the Mask of Zorro one, and these tend to be. There is something about a melody that you are anticipating turning into a song that leads you down certain paths, and Williams has almost never done that. He's been involved, obviously, in some musicals and things like that, but you think about the greats of every one of his most memorable themes, all the Spielberg stuff, you know, Schindler's List and E.T. and Jaws, but then, you know, obviously the Star Wars stuff, none of those could you possibly imagine being turned into a pop song. Even like, or even like an aria, even like a operatic treatment or something. It just somehow doesn't.
It just
work.
Doesn't lend itself that way.
Yeah,
it's totally true. And because he's thinking very much like, you know, his intervallic, you know, relations are all based on like a usually relatively chromatic harmony that's happening underneath. So picking the notes out of the blue is not that easy. But what he's really good at is creating very recognizable and repeatable shapes in his lines. And so that was sort of like when we were talking about what are we going to do for this Imperial thing, that was sort of the goal. And that was as like, not as a big fuck you to the world that thinks that it has to be singable to be memorable, but maybe in a little way. The Imperial theme, I made a point for it to be, it's actually like a complete chromatic 12-tone row.
Yeah.
So it never repeats a pitch, you know, but it's still very recognizable because it has a shape that is very familiar and repeatable. It's actually, if you were to trace the shape of the Imperial theme from Survivor, it's actually like, if you're doing a line drawing, it's like a sinus heartbeat rhythm. So it's always got that same repeating shape. Yeah. And so that was sort of like the concept. Let's come up with a shape that people will recognize. And then the pitches themselves matter a little less. You know? So then I can weave this thing into all kinds of directions harmonically by taking it, you know, melodically into new places, as long as I have that anchor of this familiar shape. You know, and
it's so funny that you point that out, because I've tried to explain this to people a lot over the years, that Williams, I thought, proved that the contour is almost the most important thing.
It is.
Because you could write a melody that goes, you know, bum, ba, ya, hum, and it's like, it feels like a variation on the Imperial March, even though you've stretched it to something that's cartoonishly not that. And that realization, as whenever, you know, early 20s or late teens or whenever, when realizing like you can vary things and make it very obvious what it is, and if it's rhythmically memorable, you can even get rid of pitch entirely.
Completely. Yeah, you really can.
Think of how many times in a Mission Impossible movie
and contour are king.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah, you're right. Yeah, Mission Impossible is like a great example. It's like just the rhythm itself. You could replace every single note.
Yeah,
play in I remember same rhythm, and everyone's going to know it.
In Mission Impossible 3, Giacchino did that. He has a big, he did two versions where he has a 7/8 version that's like clearly a little riff on it, but then also there was just one bit of just literally clunk, 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 and you're like, if you've managed to nail that thing, then
exactly it.
You know.
Yeah, that's a memorable rhythm and very catchy, and that's just as you know, sort of effective as a singable tune or a memorable tune.
Yeah,
you know, I mean, in Survivor, when spoiler alert, when Vader's on the scene, which I think we're allowed to see some spoilers. You know, I mean, even in those cases, like scoring those moments, like I didn't want to go full on Imperial March. Right. Because Vader's there. It felt a little too on the nose, a little too obvious. And I remember thinking along these, you know, contour shape, you know, sort of way of thinking. And I have in the corner of my studio, I have this poster of Vader, but it's just the silhouette of the helmet. And, and it's just as imposing and like frightening to catch out of the corner of your eye as you were to see all the detail.
Yeah.
So to me, that was like sort of like an aha moment. It's like the shape itself is enough to remind people of what it is. So there's moments when you're fighting Vader as Seer where I have the Imperial March melody in there, but it's rather subtle because it's all in like the low synth and bass, and it's just doing like bah, and that's it. You know, it's just that little shape. Like, I could continue it, but you know, just by outlining the shape was enough to kind of create this presence of Vader. And I didn't have to do that kind of thing to get that across, because that would have felt, I think, almost comical in such a serious moment in the game.
Oh, yeah. To go the game overall is so much darker
This has a
that if
very serious tone, you know?
Yeah, if it had felt if you were like doing anything that had the risk of feeling pastiche, you would have been
Oh yeah,
really
that would not have worked for this game.
yeah. Well, look, man, it's been almost 2 hours. You've been super generous. I do have one more technical kind of in the weeds question that I'm very curious that I've never actually asked you about, because one of the things that I very much appreciate about Steve Schnurr, which we heard him say literally today, is that he's opposed to this notion of game composer as a title. That there's just composers, and some do bits of everything, and some really, dial in on a given medium or a given form or whatever, but that there's no systemic reason why one ought to be defined by certainly the industry that they find themselves working in, never mind a medium. And I heartily agree. I always bristle a little bit when I get referred to as a game composer, though I love games. So I've come to kind of see it as, well, it could be worse. It could be a medium I don't like.
Right. Exactly.
And it's like podcast composer. Actually, I love podcasts, but I would be a little disappointed if I was podcast composer Austin Wintory, or something like advertising. Actually, that would be the one. I hate fucking writing. I
do too.
Like
that's
3 times ever, and was like never again.
Yep.
So yeah, that would be the one. Jingle Tunesmith.
Yeah.
So that said, though, something that I think we can acknowledge is that while the notion of being a video game composer is something that you and I would both sort of reject, working on a lot of games, one comes to appreciate that there are fundamentally different things to think about than scoring to picture or writing concert music. And that if you really deeply understand that, I think you are just bound to have an advantage. And I haven't worked with a single developer that didn't appreciate the fact that I'm a nerd for how we're going to set it up in Wise, and getting deep in with the game mechanics and play testing it and making changes based on our play testing and all that stuff. And they always seem to really enjoy that. And I'm curious because that stuff dramatically influences, at least in my case, how I go about recording, because I need elements to play with. So even if it sounds very traditionally orchestral, it rarely is.
Yeah.
Now you guys recorded, as far as I'm aware, you're still at Abbey Road recording take number 10 million right now.
Yeah, we got close.
Holy shit. This obviously aesthetically lends itself to a tutti 100-piece ensemble. Let's go for it. But how do you reconcile that with the technical needs of a game, and not just go and just say, okay, fuck it, we're going to do a brass, we're going to do a session of brass, we're going to do a session of string, or even more granular than that? Because that is a question I actually genuinely don't know the answer to.
Yeah, I mean, it's a really tricky thing to solve with that type of music, because for the audience, the biggest difference between writing for film and a game, or TV and a game, is that games have no finite timeline for the music, so it has to be interactive, and you have to find ways to make it interactive. Oftentimes with like sort of a, stacking, like a vertical, layering system or that kind of thing, and that works really well in most scenarios, but it doesn't necessarily work well for like highly symphonic music that's constantly changing tempo and meter, and is never in the same key for more than 3 seconds, and it's just like kind of all over the place. So how do you then layer that up? How do you have that music exist without any one element in it not being there? So you couldn't just have, like, for example, the strings only in a Star Wars piece of music. That then you bring the brass and then you bring the woodwinds in or whatever to like layer it up and like build up the intensity as the player progresses. That doesn't really work. So, an example is Star Wars Squadrons, another game I scored. I had to really solve for this because it was such an interactive game.
Also pandemic.
No, that too. Yeah. But ultimately what we ended up doing is for every single piece of music that I'd write, I'd have to write 3. So it wasn't that I just would write like, one piece of music and then strip elements out to get down to, okay, so now the bass layer is just, low strings and whatever. And then the next is this. Every layer of it had to have the entire orchestra involved. Otherwise it wouldn't sound like Star Wars. So I'd have to write a piece of music that was like, solid, in the style of, like fit Star Wars action cue, and then write another version of that exact same piece of music that using the exact same format. So like, same tempo, same meters, that kind of thing. So the
It's like
timeline is the
superimposed
same.
right on top of it.
Exactly. And then write a low key version of the same piece of music, and then write an even more intense version of the same piece of music. So you'd have layer 1, 2, and 3, and then it could easily switch between those layers, but each one of those layers actually involved the full orchestra. So it was never just a matter of stripping things out or additive subtracted. It was like, each piece was like conceived to fit in its particular vertical space. And so that was how we saw that, and it didn't always work. So you had to like write little transitions, because you couldn't just seamlessly crossfade from one orchestral piece to another orchestral piece. I'd have to write these little transitional elements to get there, so that it felt sort of natural to go from one thing to the next, rather than hearing two string sections crossfade over each other, when you can actually like hear like phasing or something like that.
Yeah, right.
Playing the same piece of music, just a different orchestration of it. So I mean, it was a big problem to solve. With the Jedi series, it's a little less. It's certainly interactive, but like the interaction system, particularly in Fallen Order, was not as like so robust as like something like Squadrons, where it was like, because you're constantly fighting, and it could take 5 minutes or it could take 30 minutes to get through this battle.
Right.
So always having to adapt to that. With Jedi, it's a little more, because it was more story driven. We were able to say, okay, let's just write music for the sake of music, and then like that piece of music ends, let's gracefully transition into another piece that fits this environment too. So we wrote more music than we needed for an environment, so to speak.
Right.
And then sort of had a pool of music to pull from. Survivor was a bit more interactive to that, but on Survivor, we actually, because we were, quote, modernizing the sound, and we wanted to kind of evolve the sound of what we did in Fallen Order, really push things forward. We wanted a more modern production of it. We actually did stripe everything. So we recorded, all the strings and winds as one ensemble, then all the brass alone. All percussion was like recorded, with this ensemble of 4 percussionists, and each instrument in the percussion section was recorded separately. So we had complete control over that.
Oh, wow. That's a full, that is like the Alan Meyerson.
It was the Alan Meyerson method. And
granularized the hell out of this. Yeah.
Totally granularized the entire thing. And that's really why it works the way it works. It was sort of Alan's concept in a way too. He's like, we do it this way, I have the ability to do these things and really push the sound forward. And it was a good creative choice bringing Alan on board, certainly,
so
but even more so taking his advice.
Order?
He mixed Fallen Order as well, but we recorded that completely 2D. And his suggestion from that game to the next was, we could take this further if we did this. And I'll be honest, I was reluctant at first, because I'm like, well, it's symphonic music. It really kind of needs everyone to be in the room together so they can hear how they fit in with each other. And but sort of reluctantly went into it, and it totally worked, and it still sounded great. And he was able to really kind of do new things with that, and actually gave me this ability, because I was playing a lot with sort of this electroacoustic kind of manipulation of things, where I could take back into my studio just the brass stem and run it through like some granular plugins and kind of warp it and do these things that I had sort of proofed out in the mock-up phase, and then send that over to Alan. He folds that in the mix, and you have something completely new.
Yeah, so, I love doing stuff like that. But it's a definite line that is no longer that romantic capital R orchestral sound. It's just you abandon that by definition as soon as you crack that seal. And 99% of the time, that's exactly why it's the right choice.
Yeah, exactly.
Because it's not a thing that is built to pay homage to that romantic orchestra the way Star Wars traditionally up to this point had been.
Exactly. And we still kind of wanted to, so that made it pretty tricky, because it's like, we are taking this modern approach to production, but we still want the result to feel symphonic.
Right.
So how do you do this, and how do you get best of both worlds? And it was, so it was kind of tricky. The one thing I think typically a lot of composers might do in a situation where you're really striping and layering music is you simplify the elements quite a bit. But that doesn't really work for this type of music. So it's just as rhythmically and harmonically complex as any symphonic music, which made it pretty tricky to record because, you know, when you're like, when you're just, you know, a wind player playing by yourself and you don't understand contextually where you're fitting into this whole like very strange harmonic progression, it can be kind of weird, you know, to listen to on its own. You know, it's like, so we have like making sure we're giving them context for everything they're playing. And, you know, and even with like, and to make it feel more sort of cohesive and like a symphonic recording, even like all of the synth elements, rather than just fold them in as a layer, like everything synth in that score is almost as though the synth was just another section in the orchestra, all the way to the point where, like, you know, there's moments where I had written a fugue and the synth part was actually part of the fugue, you know, so it's like it's actually interacting with the orchestra like in a conscious kind of way,
right?
Like conversational. And to make it feel like it really fit in, we took all synth parts, we did pre-recorded, and then we took them to Abbey Road and we piped them into the main room through speakers and what we call reamp everything. So we recorded all the mics that were for the orchestra through the speakers in the room, so that it felt like the synth parts were also in the room.
It's actually very Goldsmith,
very much so,
which is awesome. I love that. Well, look, man, I really just wanted to know about Ryan versus Dorkman, and so I really appreciate the overindulgence on the rest. This was worth it just alone to know that your mentor was possibly the Whiplash inspiration. So, yeah, I really, I can't thank you enough. I've been excited to do this, and I remember first bringing it up with you like seemingly 2 or more years ago, and then it was like you had already started on Fallen Order or Jedi Survivor, and it was like, this is worth waiting until after that so we can fold it into the conversation, because it, you know, the thing is, I always knew at some point it's silly to wait, because I'm sure there's stuff on the table right now that would be would be like, damn, I would have loved to have been able to incorporate that into the conversation. But that's the luxurious problem of being an in-demand composer working on cool shit. So.
Yeah, exactly, man. So no, but I'm glad we did this. It's super cool, and in a way I'm glad we waited, because there's some really cool stuff to talk about in Survivor in particular. I mean, that was like, you know, sort of revolutionizing my process in a lot of ways. So it's fun to kind of explore that and actually talk it out, you know.
And you can feel that it's there's this, again, in this wonderfully validating rebuttal of that stupid and sort of short-sighted conclusion I drew a decade ago. What I love is that through these Star Wars games in particular, I've really felt you kind of incrementally finding ways to build more of yourself into them.
Yeah.
And it's very cool. It's very cool to see, because in so many ways, what I love is that actually beautifully parallels Williams himself, where you see that in his career, that there's a real, like, certain things, especially go back to the beginning, where it's very like Mancini derivative.
Right.
It's excessively more and more. And by the time if you were to follow even just that thread, Catch Me If You Can does not sound anything like something Mancini wrote, but he started there, and then he just evolved as all human beings do. And you've paralleled that in your own way so nicely.
That's cool. That's cool to hear. And that's always been my goal, is sort of to constantly evolve my music, but also evolve my own thought process on, you know, on how music works. And, you know, like all of us artists, you know, it's a lifetime of learning and
100%.
You know, when you stop growing, you stop learning, you stop evolving yourself, then that's when you get passed up, you know. So I'm always trying to recreate my own process and thinking. So it's been fun getting to do that on one of my favorite franchises of all time. You know, it's kind of a nice palette to have.
And you've held it aloft better than anybody. So, but with that said, I suspect both of us need to get back to work. So,
most likely so.
Thanks again, man, for doing this. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. That was a lot of fun.